On this Reign of Christ Sunday, it is important to remember that Jesus is Lord. Those three words are the official motto of the World Council of Churches, that organization of Protestants and even some Catholics from across the globe, and it is quite possibly the only thing that this group of Protestant and some Catholic Christians across the globe can actually agree upon. Except, I disagree. I absolutely believe that Jesus is God, but I do not believe that Lord is an appropriate title for God and Jesus. And now, on this Reign of Christ Sunday, which is the alternative title for Christ the King Sunday, as we heard, you get to hear my manifesto against the idea that Jesus is Lord. Lucky you. Aren't you so glad you stopped in this morning? Fortunately, this manifesto is short and simple because it's all about directions and directionality. Sure, we could do a socioeconomic study of the etymology of the word Lord, how the term comes out of a feudal hierarchy, how the term YHWH, the unspoken name of God, became translated as Adonai, which later turned into Lord. But that history of translations doesn't matter to me today. It does in another way. But it doesn't matter to me as much as the urgency of the present moment when it has become more important than ever before to know where to look for God and perhaps where not to look for God. Here's the big question, the directional question, if you will. Where does the term Lord direct you to look? Up. Exactly. The word Lord exists to communicate that someone or something is above you and rightfully exists above you. The Lord is what exists and operates above you, and you are what operates below the supervision, the management, or control of the Lord. Lord is a term that cranes your neck upward in submission, obedience, reception. Lord is a term that trains you to look for power in the high places, in the human powers of the world that govern you, control you, manipulate you, are even entitled to have agendas for you that can invite you into their power, but are never required to share power with you. Lord is a term that directs you to give your life so that you may receive safety and security that is meted out to you by a Lord. Lord is a term that demands that permission always be asked, that limits freedom to only that which the powerful allow. Lord is a term incompatible with the mutuality, with equality, and Lord is a term entirely incompatible with the Messiah who came to live and dwell among us, filled with love for the friend and the stranger, who calls us to live life with sacrificial love for both the neighbor and the enemy, who lays down one's life for one's friends, whose very name, Emmanuel, means God with us, not above us, not without us, not in control of us, but God with us. Lord is a term that I even find insulting to the Jesus of the Gospels, who rejects every attempt to turn him into a king, to turn him to someone exceptional, extraordinary, and instead chooses to live a normal life of love, friendship, community, with a healthy dose of rebellion, who is killed not because he is an extraordinary threat, but a very ordinary threat to the powers of the world, who seek to send a message to anyone who thinks that they can live without lords. Lord is a term of empire, a term of human power, a term of endearment made to make you sympathize with those who manipulate the world with oppression. When Jesus' whole mission was to show how it is possible to live a life of love alone. And to make it so, Jesus gave us the gift of grace that gives us every freedom to love and serve not our lords, but one another, as Jesus loved and served us. So I reject the title of Lord as a name for Jesus because it lies about who Jesus is and where we are to look for Jesus. I reject it because, as Jesus tells Pilate, His kingdom is not of this world. Look to this passage from the climax of the Gospel of John to see how desperate we humans are to make Jesus into a Lord or a king. Pilate begins his encounter with Jesus, someone so thoroughly ordinary as to be indistinguishable from the people around him, by asking whether Jesus is the king of the Jews, because surely Jesus must be exceptional to be worth requiring his royal time. Jesus' response to the question is another question, asking Pilate where he got the idea that he was a king. Did it come from Jesus' accusers? Did it come from Pilate himself? Pilate, classic politician, dodges the question, trying to identify Jesus as someone with a nation and citizens whose reign must threaten his own political power. And then Jesus responds with the great line, "My kingdom is not of this world." This line is so often misunderstood to suggest that Jesus' kingdom must be detached from the earth, must somehow be otherworldly, ignoring how the Gospel of John emphasizes that Jesus is God in the flesh, a very earthy Messiah who merely just has no use for earthly kingdoms, for the powers and privileges and authority that earthly kingdoms fixate on, because he prefers a reign of love. So finally, Pilate asks, "So you are a king of some kinds?" And Jesus' response to his question is the very teenage response, "You say so." Because the only times that the Bible calls Jesus Lord come from our own words, desperate to maintain the image of a God who is above us, even when this God becomes human to live with and among us. And here Jesus reveals that in any attempt to turn him into a king, we become the Pontius Pilates of the world, rulers seeking to maintain hierarchies of oppression, people looking to support the masters who seek to exploit the people beneath them, participants in the long history of slavery, occupation, exploitation, the imperial project of forcing necks to look upward, the project of control that always harms God's people and God's earth when we put someone above another living thing. And so instead, Jesus identifies himself not as a king, not as a Lord, but as the truth, come to reveal the truth to anyone who receives his voice of love. Jesus' reign of love is not one that reinforces the powers and privileges of empires and authorities, but one that spreads all the power and love and presence of God as far and as wide as there is life in the universe. Jesus' reign of love is found wherever there is anyone testifying to this love, wherever there is anyone ready to hear the voice of love, wherever there is anyone ready to give and receive love. In this exchange with Pilate, a Lord in every classical meaning, Jesus reveals that the direction to look for God is not vertical, it's not up, but horizontal, turning side to side towards the God of truth and love who lives fully in the body of your neighbor. And look what happens when we take a horizontal view of God throughout our scriptures. In our reading from Daniel, it can be easy to hear the tradition of God as Lord, directing us to see God above when we hear of an ancient one on a great throne coming with the clouds. But entertain the idea that God is to be found not by looking up, but looking around. And what do we find in this passage? We hear the testimony of an ancient one, a God who has existed since the beginning of time and has been creating and cultivating the earth so that it may sustain life for us in the present. We find God moving before us to pave our way or prepare our way. We find the God behind us encouraging us onward. We find the God of love in us whose very priority is helping us to survive. And when we hear of a human one who is given dominion over the earth, we could acknowledge them as Lord above us who demands obedience and worship. Or we could see the subversiveness of a horizontal God who gives dominion over the earth, not to a king, a lord, or an empire, not some extraordinary superhuman, but the human one, the ordinary one, the Messiah who is just some guy and provides a reign of love that never ends, unlike the temporary reigns of kings and empires that all fade away. No, the reign of the ancient one and the human one, the God who is not a Lord, is the reign of the earth itself, the long life of the earth that always was and always will be, because it finds its power not in control, exploitation, or oppression, but in love, eternal love. And we see a similar God in Revelation, where Jesus is declared to be both the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. For while we could read such declarations in this passage through the lens of Jesus as Lord, for sure enough, there once again is a throne, there is dominion, there is language of hierarchy and power. But a lateral lens of Jesus' authority reveals the delightfully subversive promise of the Messiah who usurps the rulers of the earth, not by ruling above them, but by rejecting the very premise of their rule, by giving the power of priests to everyone who receives the invitation to love and serve as God loves and serves us. For indeed, Jesus has given us the grace and freedom to never serve lords and kings again, because we have everything we need to create a community that needs only to be governed and guided by the mutual commitments to love and serve one another. And in this age that is not all that different from 1925 when this holiday was initiated, I want to encourage you to hear the call, to reject the limitation of Jesus to a mere Lord. Because the promise of the Jesus who is not Lord is the one who can liberate us from the inevitability of oppression and the seemingly ceaseless cycle of harm that we do to our planet and the people who live upon it. The Jesus who is Lord reinforces the power of those who desire control over others, who seek to exploit the planet and maintain a status quo where people are exhausted, exploited, enslaved, rejected, excluded, and killed. And says that change can only come when we receive permission from the people that we crane our necks to look towards. But the Jesus who is not Lord declares that the only permission that we need to bring change to the world is the mere invitation to love when we look towards the face of our neighbor. The Jesus who is not Lord declares that Jesus can be anyone. That Jesus can be one of the 24 people executed in America each year. That Jesus can be one or all of the 1.2 million people incarcerated in American prisons. That Jesus can be one of the 30,000 houseless people living in Washington state. Jesus can be one of the millions of Palestinians living in fear of American-made weapons and bombs. Jesus can be one of the many elders whose wisdom is ignored by the economy of productivity. Jesus can be one of the many children crying unheard, asking whether this world of violence and cruelty is all that life can be. Jesus can be one of the trees and flowers and butterflies and dolphins asking for sustainability and life in this world over the illusion of industry and progress. The Jesus who is not Lord directs us to turn our heads towards the parts of this world where God's love does not yet reign over the powers of human empires and exploitation, but it can, if we but give our attention to every place where Jesus dwells. To put it positively, Jesus' reign of love will not arrive in full until we give attention to the Jesus who lives in every human being and created thing on this planet. And instead of watching them be crucified, we treat them like we wish we could have treated Jesus. For Jesus' invitation to the reign of love is already here. It merely requires us to stop looking for a Lord to stop looking for a powerful, authoritative Savior, and to look around and see, truly see one another. I invite you, look around. Turn your heads horizontal. Look to your neighbor. Who else is Jesus? Shout it out. Who is Jesus in our world today? All of us. Indeed. More specific, though, any place we don't see Jesus enough? In the least of us. Anywhere else? Customer service employees. Bless their hearts at this time of the year. Our neighbor, the neighbors we love, the neighbors we hate. Foster children. Friends and family. Absolutely. Say it again. Checkers. Sure. Our pets. Indeed. Indeed. In the face of the animals that love us and that we love. Doctors and nurses. I'm going to throw in nurse practitioners there because I'm married to one. And the teachers. Indeed. Children, sanitation workers. In the ordinary places, we find the extraordinary messiahs who give life to this world and give life to us. When we look and we see Jesus in one another, that is where we find our salvation of love. And that is where the reign of love breaks into this world. And in this age where human powers of evil and oppression seem to reign supreme, and the church cannot seem to let go, just like Pontius Pilate, of its desperate attempts to make Jesus into a king. As the sun seems to set on our belief that the powers of the world can bring us to goodness and safety, we receive a promise that Jesus' reign arrives, advents, and it is not from the powers of this world, but arrives when a young woman in an occupied land gives birth to a baby who will grow to reject all human power, choose the law of love, die for this conviction of love, rise because their love is too strong, and burn the evil empires of the world to the ground. And his name is Jesus, and he is born 267 times every minute. Across this aching world, God's reign of love is here, and it is also arriving. It is being born.